Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today on Metzia Bava Metzia daf Tzadi Aleph. We're going to begin on Sadim at base 5 lines from the bottom. Itmar Chasma b'koil v'enhiga b'kol. What happens if you shout at an animal or you lead it with a voice? What is the din? Are you going to be chayev? So this is referring to either the isser of losachsam shur, that you're not allowed to physically muzzle the animal, but what if it's not physically muzzled, you yelled at it? Does that constitute a violation of losachsam? And also when it comes to the prohibition of having a ox and a donkey together on a wagon, and you don't actually lead it, but you just yell at it, and all of a sudden the animals move, so is that a violation of kilayim? So this way the machlokas, Rabbi Yochanan bar Chaim, Rish Lakish bar Potter. So you have this machlokas. Rabbi Yochanan bar Chaim, why? Because he holds kimas piv havi maisa. Even your words alone constitutes an action to be chayiv malchus. Rish Lakish bar Potter kol loy havi maisa. Your words is not the same thing as a maisa. Your words are words, not the same as an action. Is Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan has a question of Rish Lakish. You say that you're Potter, as we continue to study Alpha and Man Aleph. Lo she'adam r'shayil hamir elshim hemer mumer v'sevek zaraboyim. So what is this referring to? Says Rashi, Reish and Masnisin Hakol Mamirin Echad Anashim Ve'echad Anashim. Now when it comes to Tumura, if you have an animal which is Kodesh, so you with your words make this animal, the second animal, Kadosh. You transfer the Kedusha from animal A to animal B. So that's a Tumura. Now we know that the din is that you're not supposed to do that. The reality is the first animal still remains kadosh, but it's still considered to be a valid action. But the point is that v'sevgas are boyim. So why do you get malchus? Mishum, says Rashi, yachlifenu v'hacha dedibur al mahu v'laki. We see clearly when it comes to just words alone, you can still get malchus. So it's a kasha Rish Lakish. So the truth is, this is not in according to all opinions. There's an opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, Rashi quotes the Gemara in Makkas, says, when it comes to the din of noiser, you're supposed to burn it. And it says, so because it's a lava nitakla say, it's because there's an action, what you could do to burn it, so therefore you're not going to get malchus. So whenever you have a lav and nitak asay, you have an asay that fix up the lav, so instead of you getting malchus, you're supposed to do that action. Taima, says Rashi, the Bahag Kasev, only because there's this asay. Halav hachi lucky. Hamoiser. If you would leave it over, you would get malchus. The afagav dein maisa. So you see, just leaving it over, which is a lav shema maisa, you would get malchus, except for the fact that it's a lav and nitak asay. If it was not for a lav and nitak asay, you would get malchus, which is mashma. We see a lav shema maisa, you get malchus. Mimatzis mukmis lok Rabbi Yehuda. We taka say this is like the shita of Yehuda v'hal katani reisha. In the reisha over there it says hakol mamirin echad nashim echad nashim. Everyone can do two more. Vavina moyas hakol soyimai. We see yirish. We say it's coming to include a inheritor. Says Rashi shim hamer b'karbon aviv. Let's say you did Tumura on your father's carbon, liachar misas aviv mummer. That, in other words, your father had a carbon, and he died, and then you, the son who inherited this carbon, that the Yerusha, that as a Yerusha, that constitutes as a good Tumura. You could do this. We actually hold, according to Rabbi Yehuda, now like this, that you cannot do Tumura, a Yerush cannot do it. And the Gemara is explained over there in the beginning of the first parak. Why does he say this by Yerush is not, can't do Tumura, and why he's not doesn't do Smicha? But anyway, the point is, clearly that Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, it's a question. So the answer is no. The Tana holds like Rabbi Yehuda regarding the notion that there is no, that you can get Malchus on a lav, Sheba Maisa, but he disagrees with another one, because Rabbi Yehuda says that a Yerush cannot do Tumura, but this Tana holds that unlike Rabbi Yehuda, that Taka or Yerush could do. Tanaban, so a person muzzles incorrectly his ox, Vidashba, and he has it work. So like it, So as we said, you get malchus. But in addition to that, Mishalom dal kabel lepar begimel kabel lechamor. Why? Says Rashi, Shir chachamim achilasai. The fact is, we're supposed to eat, and therefore, since you took this animal and you didn't feed it, so therefore you are chayiv to pay this amount. Okay. So but we have a din that because of the din of Kedei Shasai, so therefore you shouldn't be able to get two punishments, malchus and death, as well as malchus and paying. So how can we say Elokim Mishalom? So this is going to be question 3, question TB 18. So he gives 3 answers. Omer Bai, Hamani Rameir, he diyir Elokim Mishalom. There's a shita in malchus that says, based on Adam Zayman, if you say that you have a first group of witnesses saying, I know that Reuven owes Shimon $200, and it turns out they're Adam Zayman, so then they get malchus because they're Adam Zayman, and in addition to that, they have to pay the 200 zuz. So there's 2 punishments that they get, even though it's one thing. So who is like that? That's the shita of Rameir. So Rameir will say the same thing here. Rav Omer's second answer, Esnan asotayr afil bal imoy. So what is this? So there's a din by an esnan of a person that's going to pay money to a zoina for her services. So the din is that money, if let's say or an animal, gave her an animal, that animal cannot be brought as a carbon. It's not allowed to be brought as a carbon. Now, what happens if he decides to give an esnan, he's boil imoy, with one of his relatives? Of course, it says literally his mother, his relative, and she happens to be a zaina. And because of a person does this, of course, it's an isser, a significant isser. There's a death penalty involved here, because that's one of your krayvim. But technically, you also owe her money, but you don't have to pay her. But if you did pay her, even though you didn't have to, it's still an esnan. That's what it means. That the esnan asr tayra b'fil bal imoy. Even if you didn't have to give it to her, the Beis Din would never require you to have to pay her. So the din is that technically, if you did give it, then that's what it is. So look at Rashi. But nasan tleb esnanhu. If you gave this zaina, who's your relative, an esnan, it counts as esnan. Therefore, if also carbon, it's still usher. The esnan stomachs it. Loshna imoshna pnuya. Doesn't matter who this is. It's a karev, not a relative. V'yavgav di tavule bedina. Come on. If this woman who's your relative would go to base and say, "Oh, he owes me money for the services rendered," tinle esnani lo mechayvinin le. We don't require him to pay her to come b'ramine because he's already getting a death penalty. So you're not going to have to pay money. It's like adding salt to the when you're already going to be chayv misa, and now all of a sudden we're going to make you pay a couple bucks. So kiev nihile, but if he did taka give it to her anyway, esnanhu, it's an esnan alma. If feel b'makam misa. Even if in the time of Misa we do say in the Taka there's an element of him paying, that maybe he should pay. We don't have the ability to actually punish him with 2 punishments, but technically he should pay it. And therefore if he does give her an esnan, it's an esnan. He can't be Ras Carbon. Even though from our courts we can't do anything about it, but min hashamayim hitaka is still chayav to pay. Di'u amru tashuman away ki yavin hiwe mi havi yasnan matana b'almahu di'ayvla. Okay. The gabi chayisim nami. Also, when it comes to this case, why are we bringing this down? Because you say that by chayisim as a part of dashbal like a mishalim. Why? So why tashlumin? Because tashlumin ramalei. Because again, the animal lost food. Again, the basis can't force these 2 punishments. He hasn't fulfilled his obligation until he pays. And or inami if Taka the guy would grab it, then we're not going to take it away because since it's really owed to him. So that is another interpretation. Okay. Answer number 3. Rapapal Amir Mishas Mashicha ichayev leim b'mezonoseh u'milka loki ad shas chasima. So the only time we say kamen barabina is when they both happen simultaneously, v'asachas. But over here they happen at different times. So as Rashi says, the inboin ke'echad, since they didn't happen at the same time. Why? So again, because Rav Papa holds that as soon as there was Mashiach was done, he's obligated to pay for the food. But he's not going to eat malchus until the actual chasima. So because he took over these animals, he has the obligation to feed them. So therefore, because of that, he's already chayav from before. And now he only has an obligation of malchus later on. So therefore, once he actually muzzles them. Okay. Amar Papa, Hani Mili Bo Minoi de Beira Papa Barabo. Upashlu Isura. Chad Kehilchasa v'chad Delav Kehilchasa. So there were these questions that were posed, and they're not necessarily related to Bava Metzia issues, but one was Kehilchasa, one was not Kehilchasa. So what was that? Bo Minoi. Ma Lolishas Isa B'chol. Is a person allowed to have dairy bread? Are you allowed to knead dairy or milk inside of bread? We said that it is aser because obviously we can understand there's a great possibility that you'll end up eating it together with meat. Kehilchasa upashul l'isur kehilchasa. The sanya, that's the halacha. In losh nasi sabachol, you can't knead dough with milk. Being losh, if you did, kol pas kul asura, it's all asur. Nay hergel avera, because of hergel avera, says Rashi. Shal yochabasi yama, again, you should knead it with meat. Kiyatzava, similar to that, in tashin as a tanur ba'alya, a person cannot smear into an oven meat fat. And then all the bread is aser. And shiasik is a tanur, and to basically kasher up the oven. So it's the same idea, is that we can't make the bread meat. It's got to be parv. The idach and the other statement, can you put two different animals, which one's a zach, one's a nekeva, but they're not the same breed, into a pen? So is that considered, as Rashi says, mihavi kimarvia kilayim? Is it like you're actually involved in having these two animals breed, which is mixed breeding, which is aser? Olo an shiyachasu ba'atzmo ever hazachar vayachnas. Is it only that you're going to violate the isser of kilayim of animals when you physically put these animals together? Upashli surah the lav hilchasa. So he said that you're not allowed to even put them into the pen. But the truth is that's not the halacha. Yemer Shmuel v'nafim ad shiru kederach v'nafim, which is more in Makos. In order to say that a person has actually violated having tashmish with someone who would be a crime, so you can only testify on them when you actually see them having relations. You don't actually have to see the actual physical genitalia, so to speak, touching, but just as long as it has the physical appearance from afar that they're actually having relations, that is enough that you could testify against them. However, in order to violate kilayim, you're not going to be chayiv until you mamish take the aver of the male animal and insert it into the nekeva's genitalia, which is kamachachol b'shveiferes, just like a Q-tip going into a tube. So that is the only time really it's going to be aser. So the truth is, he said it was aser even to put them in, but the truth is that's not the halacha. Achtavoy bar ami. If the pasuk would have only have said that animals you should not mix breed, I would say that you should not hold on to an animal by the horns, so you shouldn't be an active participant in helping. It says Rashi, Lo yachas as abahema bekarneh. Don't hold an animal by its horns. B'shasha oil has zachar while it's being mounted. They feel min b'minoi. So it means like you're holding onto the animal so that they are able to cohabit. Talmud kilayim. So we say kilayim. La machladi kilayim achiza nami loy. It's a mashma that you shouldn't be able to hold onto the animal by the horns as well. So my achiza, what does that mean? It means hachnasa. It actually means putting the male member into the female. You might call it achiza. So why is it like holding onto the horns? Lishnamalia. That's just saying it in a nice way. That's really not what we're referring to. Rabbi Yehuda, min b'minu mutal hachnas k'machachal b'shvayferes. So when it comes to actual proper breeding, you are actually allowed to make sure that they're breeding by having by putting the aver of the zachar into the area of the woman, of the female animal. There's no issue of pritzos at all. My taima, because he's basically involved in doing his job. This is what is supposed to be. This is what he needs to do to be able to have these animals breed, and sometimes they don't do it on their own, so you have to be proactive. Says Rashi, mishum deshema yavli dehir davar, maybe it'll cause your hirhor kedamrinan. We yistako b'chamor b'chazav b'chazira b'shash shehin mezavgin v'niskokin zemzeh. You really shouldn't be staring at animals while they're having relations with one another. Says Rashi, the hasam kisheinu shaloi. They're not your animals. She'enu tzarich l'sayeh. You're not really. You don't have any need to be there. Here, this is your job. These are your animals. So it's not going to have any improper thoughts. Meisiv Rav Achtavoy Barami, as we continue to pay all of Amud Beis. I've only said this regarding mixture of animals. Then again, the person should hold on to the horns. The whole isser is only when it's min b'mina. Again, it doesn't mean holding onto the horns. It means mamish k'machachal b'shvayferes, but that's only usher because it's min sheno minoi. Which is mash min b'minoi, it's allowed. Min b'minu nami achiza in nasa loy. So my achiza achnasa. My karli achiza lishnamalia. Again, it's just the lishnamalia. Ravashi ha milsa bomine debei rav nechem yeresh galusa mahu shaknus min minu. What is the din about putting two animals, a zachar and a keva? They're both, let's say, the same breed. V'she'eno minoi ladir, but then you have another eno minoi there. So kivandika mine basu mine garer. Since it has its own, it's going to go after its own. Maybe you're not allowed to do that. He said that no, it's aser, but the truth is not halacha. So why was he so strict? Because of pirtzutz de avdi, because of the slaves that are involved in this process. This is why he was so strict. Says the next mission. This is mastista. Let's say this worker. So when is he allowed to eat these fruits? If let's say he works with his hands, of a little baraglav and on his feet, baraglav his feet, not his hands. If a little bit seifa, all it does is work with his shoulders. He can still eat. He can eat from the field, even though he's not working with his hands and feet. He's working with part of his body. He's still working. Rabbi Hitaka has to be working with his hands and feet. So my timer. So why do we say any is okay? Because the pasuk says kamriyacha b'choil mind of it. So it says you go into the field to do work. So it means any work. If you're working with your hands, you're working with your feet, you're working with your shoulders. Anyway, it's fine. However, Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Aimer and Shiasa B'yada Barago. So my time, Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. Why does he say hands? You have to have the hands and feet involved. He's short because we compare a person being able to eat the feet from the field to an ox that eats. Mashur and Shiasa B'yada Barago, but an ox is using all four of its legs. Of Poyol and Shiasa B'yada Barago, so too a person. So Boy Rabba Bar Rav Huna Doshba Vazim Goylim. Let's say you are having these birds, chickens, geese. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, who says you have to have four legs, mahu. Is it just you have to use all the koyach and this bird, which is really walking on only two legs? That's still enough because it's b'chol koyach. Which therefore would mean that there's no issur when it comes to birds. Question 4a. Matzad lifter asadash b'tanagoyim mechasima. So as we see, because it's possible we're talking about, it has to be like a shore which has 4 legs. Omer Rav Nachman, Omer Rabba Baravua, Po'alim, when it comes to workers, Achlo, Hilchu, Shesi ve'erev begas, Oichlim anavim. Ve'en shoysin yayin, Mishehilchu Shesi ve'erev begas, Oichlim anavim shoysin yayin. So let's understand this. So when it comes to workers, we say, when are they allowed to eat? Until before they went Shesi ve'erev, they went back and forth like warp and woof. So before they went to this, says Rashi, Darchan lahatil anavim alagas is the way to take the grapes to the vat. The darchin baragleim, and they would press them by stepping on with their feet with this vat. The actual hilchul b'shesi ve'erev, until they went both directions. Ein malachtan nikeres beyayin, it's not recognizable that it's wine. Elba novim, it still looks like grapes because they haven't really trampled a lot. Lafikach ein sheisin yayin, until they go shesin erev, they cannot drink wine. Because they're really working up until the shesin erev with grapes, and therefore they can't eat wine, which is considered a separate min. So let's read this again. Until they went both ways, they're only allowed to eat the grapes, but not wine. However, once they've already gone enough, so that it's clear that they're doing it for wine, therefore there's some wine, there's still some grapes there too, and therefore for that reason they're allowed to eat both. Okay, question 4b. What can he eat? So until he goes Erev Shasi, he can only eat the grapes, not the wine. But once he went Sheres Erev, he can eat grapes and drink wine. Let's see the next Mishnah. It says the Masitim. So again, according to what we just let it off, that if you're working with one min, you can't use the other, right? If you cannot be oichel b'min acher. So that's the idea, that if you're working with figs, you can't eat grapes. If you're only working with grapes, you can't eat the figs which are nearby. But you could wait and hold yourself back until you get to the superior crops and then eat. So basically, you can do all of your eating to get to the nicer quality crops. And that's not a problem. The cool one, Lo Amru, El B'Shas Malacha. Everything that we're saying that you can eat this is only while you're actually working, not while you're sitting. You can't just be sitting around and then eat. No, you actually have to be while you're in the process of working. Abu Mishum Hashem Aveda Labalim, in order to basically save money, because if this guy's eating while he's like doing his harvesting, which could be a waste of time, so let him work straight while he's working the field, because it will save Hashem Aveda Labalim Amapam Oichem Chasan. Let them eat even after they finish a particular row, unless they're going to the next row. Now, even though they're really not doing work at this moment, but they're just walking anyway, so they have to go there anyway. So it's actually good for the Baal Bayis for him to eat while he's going from one row to the next during this time, because this way, while he's working on the row, he's working non-stop, and while he's walking anyway to get to the next row, let him eat then, even though Me'ikar Adin he shouldn't be allowed to, but it's good for the Baal. The Chazirasan Minagas, when he comes back from the vat, so again, even though it doesn't seem to be the best time to do it, because he's not working, but it actually is the best time for the Baal Bayis. When it comes to a dog, the Mishnah concludes, Kshi Porekas. It can eat from its load while it is being unloaded. Says the Gemara. So if, let's say, again, you want to eat grapes, but they're not from the same vine. You're working with one vine, could you eat from a different vine? Does it have to be the same species of what you're putting into the vessel of the Baal Bayis? And it is, because you're plucking grapes. So what if the grapes are nearby, but they're also grapes? Well, Dilma Mamashiat the nice look kale shabal bias being on Vahaleka. Maybe it's totally on the very grapes that you're putting into this kli, which is this vine and not a different vine. Maybe you hold that if you are working with one vine, you can't eat from another vine. So So how do we understand when it comes to an ox and we're dealing with something which is mechuber, we're dealing with foods which are attached to the ground. So how are they able to eat from this? So let's look at Rashi. If let's say he can't eat it while it's attached, we know he could. So, but how can you do it? He can't possibly be eating from that same vine. Shahari kosher with semet, because it's tied in front of the wagon. So basically, the point is, it's not a possibility because while it's eating, so that which is eating is not what's being put into the wagon. So it's not the same thing. It's actually comparable to a different vine. So Rav Sheshet Rav Yidi, what are we talking about? Bishracha. What does that mean? So Rashi says, Bizimira arucha ma'oid. We're talking about very long branches of vines. Umagas avnei ashor. No, we're actually saying when is it allowed to eat if it is the same vine as that's being harvested. That is the only thing that they're allowed to eat. So how is it possible that they're not right next to each other? No, if it's a very long vine, it could be. Tashma. So if you're working with figs, don't eat grapes, which is mashma. It's mashma figs and figs, which you could eat, even though it's comparable to figs and grapes. Namely, they're not exactly right next to each other. You can still eat. Now, if you want to tell me that you cannot eat from another vine, so how do we find a situation where you have we allow you to eat grapes that are not the same grapes? Apparently, from a different vine. So, Rav Sheshet, we're talking about b'medulas, that the trees hanging over one another. Let's look in Rashi. We need both. Min has to be the same min. So why does it mention figs and grapes? Obviously not. Which is mashma figs and figs you could eat. But we're talking specifically in a case where the figs are like mixed up with the grapes. O gefen mudel al te'ena, or the grapevines are like hanging over the figs. Vashmi'inan in the Chiddush of our Mishnah is you still cannot eat from the figs because you're working with the grapes, even though they're right next to each other. It looks like you're really working with both of them. Because you need to lift up and remove the branches. In order to cut them, you're kind of really working with both. But it's not the min that you're taking, right? The owner said, I want you to take figs. So the truth is, the grapevines are all mixed up. You're actually lifting up the grapevines. You're kind of working with the grapes too, but because you're not actually putting these grapes into this basket, only figs, and therefore that's the reason why you can't do it. So the chiddush is even when it's a case where it's memudelos. Tashma. So you don't have to eat right away. You can just wait until you get to the higher quality food. If you can just eat from another vine anyway, then just go and eat over there. So the whole issue over here is bit malacha. Says Rashi, because the problem of going back to a different place and coming back to where you're supposed to be working, that's no kasha. Certainly you should not be allowed to do that. The question is, let's say you can still work, and you have your wife or your children who are not getting paid from the Baal Bayis. Can they get it for you? So you're still working, you're not going to the other field or the other row. So Tashema, you can only eat while you're working. In order to be able to save money from the Baal, we were lenient. We said, even while they're going from one row to the next, that is allowed for them to eat. When they're returning from that. Now, Savrura, apparently we hold the Mahalach K'oisa Maisadami. The worker moving from one place to the next right now is also like he's doing an action. He's actually doing some element of work. Says Rashi, K'oisa Maisadami. V'yeshel echel. That's the reason why he's allowed to eat. But the only reason why really he's allowed to work, he's allowed to eat, is because of Hashem Aveda. Midaraisa we don't want him to eat, because since really it isn't considered a time of working, and he isn't working with other fruits. Could eat from another fruit. The whole point is that while you're walking, it's not considered as though you are working. Okay, let's look at question 5 in TA 17. Why do we midaraisa say they cannot eat while they're going from one place to the next? Either because because walking is not like an action of work, or alternatively, because it's a similar thing that if you're eating from one vine, you can't eat from another one. And on this Igadami, some say a little different. That walking is not like an action. That's the reason why you can't eat, because you're not working. Mishum because you're not working. If taka it was considered like you were working, then you would be able to eat. We see that even though you weren't working with those other things, you could still eat. So it must be the whole reason why you can't eat is because it's mahalach is lav ka'isa ma'isa. But if it was, then you could eat even from a different geffen. Really, you cannot eat from a different one. As we continue to study Be'ezam Alf. And again, technically, he's allowed to eat because while he's walking. The only issue, midaraisa, is that he's eating from other foods. Says Rashi, if it wasn't for Hashavas Aveda, we wouldn't allow him to eat. And we conclude this daf with the last part of the Mishnah, that when it comes to a donkey, it can eat while it is being unloaded. So while it's being unloaded, how could it eat? Says Rashi, Kol masa parkin b'masachas v'holchen. It's all unloaded at one time and goes. She'em achete parekes, until. In other words, as Rashi says, b'olichasa, while it's going, oichelas memaso yishal gaba. Not just at the time that it's being unloaded, but up until that time. So even though the animal has this bundle on it, it could still eat then. They can eat from the bundles on them. It's just that the owner, or the person, cannot feed it, this animal, by hand. Adkan.